Greetings to all and welcome to episode 1 of the new Losing Our Marbles talk show. Our new format, an open debate, live fact-checking symposium, if you will. Symposium's a good word, isn't it? It's a good word. It's a good word. Today, we're going to touch on the idea of fettering capitalism. Yes, it's a word. I don't care what you say. If you can unfetter something, if something can be unfettered, you can fetter something. Simple English. I don't want to hear any argument about it. That's it. That'll be a topic for another week. We'll have our own week for Englishing words. Anywho, so we got some work to do. Step 1, we must define our terms. Step 2, we must construct our conflicting arguments. And then step 3, we will resolve the argument. So yeah, let's get into it, shall we? Let's go to our fancy screen here, our fact board, if we will. We gotta do some work here in Noteland. We got the Noteland here. Can you read this? Can you read this? Everything's about the same size. I like that. Good. Great. All right. Fantastic. Okay, capitalism with an A. I'm gonna my spelling is so, like, I can figure out the spelling, but my initial spelling of things is so bad. Like, trust me. It's gonna be you're gonna learn some things about me in this new format with how my brain works. It's gonna be capitalism. Capitalism. It's a lot of things that flow through the brain very quickly. It's hard to keep everything straight. All right, capitalism. We have to define capitalism. Now, I have my own personal definition of capitalism, and then there are more universal and scholarly accepted definitions of capitalism. So let's start off where the Shen is coming from, as far as capitalism in the Shen brain, and then we're going to revise that definition as we break down. So in my mind, capitalism is very simple. It is based on capital, which is personally owned resources, right? So you can, oh geez, the formatting is so bad. Can we, there we go. No, don't scroll. Don't scroll. Why did everything moved? Why is it, oh God, that's terrifying. Why? Why does it do that? Anyway, so personally owned resources is the driving force, and then the philosophy to that being to acquire, acquisition. Let's say acquisition. How do you spell acquisition? I don't know. Acquisition equals winning, right? The more resources you have, the better capitalist you are, right? That's the structure. So, in my mind, the name of the game is efficiency. It's a economic efficiency. It's getting as much for as little as possible, right? Which in my mind is inherently bad, but understandable considering that that's how nature works, right? That's nature. Nature is capitalism, essentially, right? On the macro scale, it's everything tries to get all the resources it can, and the mutual atrocity across the board levels out in a stable system, which is, great if you're an animal. If you're an animal, it's great. So, things and stuff and things, right? So let's try to go for a more eloquent definition of capitalism. Let's see what the world comes at. All right, let's see. We can start with Wikipedia. Wikipedia is always going to give us a launching pad. Britannica is going to have a really good definition. Good on that. And Merriam-Webster, why not? Let's get the dictionary involved. Teen Vogue, another very, very... That's going to be a running joke, I can tell already. It's going to be a running joke that all these credible sources we come across in our searches. All right, now, as many people will say, Wikipedia is not a source. Correct. However, you know what's great about Wikipedia? Hold on, there's a lot on Look. Sources. Oh. Right? So, yes, Wikipedia, not a source. However, everything on Wikipedia is sourced. Oh, amazing. If only there was something to... Okay, so let's see what capitalism's saying here. And oh wow, four citations for the very first sentence of the definition. So let's go down and see what those four sources are. Sherman and Brown, Comparing Economic Systems, seems a viable book. Mariana versus Rosser, J. Barkley. MIT Press, seems good. Core Sociological Dichotomies by Chris Jenks. I'm not as sold on that one, but that's okay. And Robert Gilpin on The Challenge of Global Capitalism. Who is Robert Gilpin? Can we do a quick rabbit hole on Robert Gilpin? I fucking love researching things. I love it. This is what I do in my spare time. American political scientist, professor of politics and international affairs at Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. Seems credible. I'll bite. Robert Gilpin, checks out. Checks out. It checks out. Okay, so economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit. I'm pretty close. Central characteristics of capitalism include capital accumulation. Acquisition equals winning. Bam. Look at us. Fucking. We're on the nose. Competitive markets. All right, I was a little less nuanced than that. A price system. Oh, interesting. So, according to Wikipedia, at the very least, and this is okay. So this is sources 5 and 6, which is going to be Capitalism by Robert L. Heilbronner, as published in the New Palgrave Dictionary of Economics. Seems credible. And Louis Hyman on the American Capitalism on the Wayback Machine. Wayback Machine apparently very apparently often used. I see a lot of Wayback Machine references as I go through the internet. It's always I don't even know if it is actually credible, but yeah. Interesting stuff. Anyway, so interesting to see that like money. So we had a price system. So the money being an inherent part of capitalism, apparently. I'm debating this in my mind already. It does say any form of money, which could be, chickens, right? It could be a chicken-based capitalism, which I am all for chicken-based capitalism. Seriously, we got billions of chickens. Why? Imagine walking around with your cage of chickens. going to the car dealership. Be 4,000 chickens, please. I got them right here, bud. I got my chickens right here. I'll pay in feathers, bud. Like instead of using a credit card, like credit card or cash, and you say I'll pay in cash. Like I'm paying in flesh, baby. Pay it in colors. Pay it in feathers. Well, isn't that's the that was, I can't remember if it was China or Japanese culture, where their currency symbol is it's how they used to pack rice. It was like a block of rice, and the initial currency was like the amount of rice a human being needed for a year. Like that's how you measured your worth. And so, like the samurai, I think it was China. No, I think it was China. But like so emperors and lords and things that owned land would harvest their rice and then count how many people they could feed for a year with their harvest, and that was their worth. And like that's what the currency derived from, in its very roundabout way. So. There are systems like that. At least there were in history. Nowadays, digital currency is the way to go. But there have been systems on larger scales that used things like that. Even gold, technically, fairly cumbersome, right? If you actually had to materialize your net worth in gold, like that would, you would need a forklift, right? So a price system, good enough. Private property. Okay, so now this is another interesting facet I kind of overlook here. So private property. The necessity of having not just the means of production, but the land that it is on. That is very interesting. So we're gonna. I think that's worth noting. Like price system, I think is just kind of inherent, just trading, the ability to trade resources. I don't think, like by definition of it being an economic system, like I think trade has to be inherent. I don't know if there's any economic system where trade is forbidden. But yeah, so okay, we're gonna add that to the list. So what we have is acquisition equals winning, and private land apparently also being important. Who knew? Okay. And this is just Wikipedia, man. Like, whew, we're in. This is fun. I'm having fun. I don't know if you guys are having fun, but to me, this is a good time. Right here, the Wikipedia page on capitalism is a good time for Shen's TV. Anyway, recognition of property right. Oh, geez, I didn't mean to click. The recognition of property rights. Okay, so what we're trying to discern here is that it's starting to lean in the direction of requiring a government to regulate, right? So property rights would require an agreed upon set of rules that is somehow enforced to ensure that these things are maintained, right? So we're already just into the vague definitions of capitalism. We're already putting in government regulation of some kind, which is interesting to note. But again, I don't feel like that's inherent. Like saying you need a system to enforce the rules is like, well, that's the application, right? That's not capitalism. This is getting into the application of capitalism, right? So capitalism is the set of rules, and then you need a system to enforce the rules, right? So not fully sold on that inside the definition of capitalism. Outside, in the application of capitalism, definitely. But I wouldn't say it inherent to capitalism. All right, voluntary exchange. There we go. So voluntary exchange. So they're differentiating between a price system and a voluntary exchange. Now that's interesting because a price system, like the price system is the negotiations of the voluntary exchange, right? So if you had a price system, then you wouldn't have voluntary exchange because things would be fixed. They would be set, bread costs $1.25. To me, that's what a price system is in contrast to a voluntary exchange, right? But I will say, so we've mentioned it twice now. So I think at this point, between competitive markets and voluntary exchange, even though I'm pretty sure there's no economic system that does not allow trade. I'm pretty sure that's what economy is trade. But free trading, which again, that's kind of what this is about, right? Truly free trading seems like a bad idea, but we'll get into that. So, should we say free trade instead of free trade? Free trade. We'll just say free trade. Okay, and then wage labor. All right, so now we're getting again into some more interesting things. So, selling labor. I think that's a better, instead of saying wage labor, because now we're understanding why these definitions here. So the reason you need to have a price system is you need a way to monetize labor, right? That's the link. The reason why they mention price system outside of voluntary exchange is because they want a system in which you can monetize labor. And I think we can more simply and elegantly describe that as just sellable labor. You can sell your goods or you can sell your labor, right? I think that's fair. Great. Good launching pad for capitalism. Let's move on. Britannica. How are we doing here? All right, capitalism, also called free market economy or free enterprise economy, which are both good terms in that opinion. Is the means of production are privately owned, and production is guided and income distributed largely through the operation of markets. So, letting the market decide, right? That's where we're coming in with that. I feel like this is a very bad definition of capitalism, but kind of what we said, right? So that was kind of where we started with our definition. So it was as bad of a definition as ours was. So if my initial inherent definition of capitalism is as good, if not better, than Britannica's definition, I think we're off to a good start. That sounds like a good place to launch from. Because that's right. So we have privately owned production, and we said personally owned resources, right? And income distribution through markets, which we call acquisition equals winning, right? Like that's what we said. We just used less big words. Fantastic. All right, we're going to get rid of Britannica here. All right, Merriam-Webster, just because dictionaries are fun. A way of organizing guys so that the things that are used to make and transport products are owned by individual people and companies rather than by the government. Okay, so this is a contrast, right? This isn't so much a definition as it is a contrast. So it's not explaining what capitalism is. It's saying more what capitalism is not. And that it is where the government does not own and regulate everything. The people and companies do. Which, again, I think is a horrible idea. But that's what the stream's about. All right, we have a question in chat. Sabath wants to know, how would I describe pieces of art, like a nice painting, when it comes to capitalism? Why does something getting older become more valuable? Do you need fools to add value to something that gets older? I would say the only correlation between age and value is rarity, right? So over time, things can only be destroyed. So when Monet makes paintings and then he dies, suddenly there will never be more Monet paintings, right? So when you have one of only 3 Monet paintings in existence, when he's just starting as an artist, there will be more than 3 Monet paintings added to the market. So you have 1/3 of the existing market, but your share is going to go down over time, right? But then after Monet dies, if you have one painting of his, let's say 5,000, I don't know how many he actually has. Let's look it up. Total Monet painting. I think that's how you spell Monet. Claude Monet. How many paintings? How many? How many? Give me a number. It's not going to tell us, is it? $1,365. Okay, I overestimated. Apparently, according to WikiArt. So, after he dies, right? You have 1 out of 1,600 Monet paintings, but no Monet paintings will be added to that market share ever again. And because we live in a material world, those will only be destroyed over time. They will never be created over time. So your shares are guaranteed to go up, right? Now, the reason why you have to define that as a rarity rather than an age is because there are plenty of things that are stupid cheap. The ancient Chinese coins with the little square punched in the middle, those, like, you could dig in your backyard in China and find, 1,000-year-old coin, right? They're everywhere. So they're not that valuable, even though they're historic, right? And same thing with a lot of certain fossils, right? Trilobite fossils are just everywhere. You're not going to make a lot of money on them, even though they're millions of years old. They're not worth a lot, right? Because they're everywhere. There's no rarity, right? 2,500 paintings. Thank you, Lel. I appreciate. See, this is why we do this. I like it. So rarity, right? So how does rarity fit into capitalism? Since we go back to our broad definition of resources, right? If a resource is rare, then that is a higher demand and a lower supply, and that's not even capitalism. That's just economics, right? So as long as it's recognized as a resource, and art is recognized as a resource, the general rules of economics apply. So if you want an actual Monet painting, not a print, not a copy, but an actual Monet painting, in order to get that resource, you have to compensate for its rarity, and therefore you have to have more resources to trade for the rarity of the resource. Roughly, Doom. Roughly. I mean, we're not gonna construct a working quantifiable formula on the spot here, but roughly. And I wouldn't argue that age is what makes it more valuable. It's that rarity inherently increases over time. So, yeah. Going back to the initial SEMAF question is that, yes, you can add value to something, to someone who is uneducated, by saying it's old, right? But that, I wouldn't say that in the broader definition that a price is what's agreed upon, right? Like currency is what is agreed upon. I would imagine most educated individuals would agree on the value of something and would not increase the value just because it is older, right? So I don't think you need fools to add value to something. And I think adding value to something because they are a fool, again, going back to the initial comment or initial concept of the episode today, yes, I would say that's a bad thing. The idea that a fool and their money is soon parted is a predatory, parasitic mindset in my mind. I think that is a very dangerous morality to hold, in that someone who is stupid does not deserve to be protected, right? Like that that's inherently dangerous morally, in my opinion, because there are people who are like genuinely mentally retarded, and to say that they are not deserving to have their capital protected from swindling is a horrific concept, right? So, I would say at this point we need to make a strong line, and that line is going to be between capitalism and salesmanship, right? So you could say salesmanship is an inherent fallout of capitalism, because if you can put in a little work relatively by storytelling to increase the value of your product, that is something capitalism rewards, right? But that is not an inherent part of capitalism. And again, that's what this is all about. It's what is inherent in capitalism, what is the natural fallout of capitalism, and what should and can be done about it, right? So we're not drifting away. We're establishing definitions. That's the whole point, right? So that's the whole point, is that we have to explore the space before we can contain the space, right? If we don't go beyond the boundaries of what we are containing, then we don't know the size of the container. That is a part of the process. So we're all doing good things. Trust me, as scatterbrained of an individual as I may be, when I have a task, when I'm in charge of something, we fucking get it done. We stay on point. We'll get it done. So if we go too far, I'll let us know that we're going too far. But we're still on point as far as I'm concerned. Cool. All right. So now we have to define the second term. And no, this is not a made-up word. Fettering. Regulation through an authoritative body. That's not how you spell authoritative. Authoritative, maybe. Yeah. Can we? I mean, yes, it's a word that has been made up many times. But are we? Any oppositions? Any oppositions to where we've? Is that how the heck? How is authoritative not a word? That's gotta be authoritative. Authorities, maybe it is with an I. I don't know. It just whatever. It's now a word. We're making up more words. What's authoritative? That's gotta be a word, right? That's gotta be a word. Authoritative. Ah. It was both an A and an I. See, I was close. Authoritative. We got it. We got there. We got there. I knew there was an I and an A somewhere. Apparently it was both. Again, how my brain works. So, I don't see any objections in the chat. Are we cool? We cool with what we've established so far? I'll pause for objections. Dramatic sip of coffee. Boundaries? What about boundaries? Great. Doom concurs. I like it. Confirmation in the positive is always good. Setting them by way of regulation. Oh, okay. So establishing boundaries. Okay. So I think, yeah, regulation would be the boundaries. All right, no. Yeah. Yeah. Regulation is the act of imposing boundaries, right? Right. All right, so I'm gonna construct my initial argument now that we've established. Now I wonder, is there a way I can save this and make a new one? Is there can I chapter these things? What is this? Add page. Oh, it's so good. Look at that. Oh my God, that's so good. So now look, I got pages. We can go back to things. Look at that. Look. Oh. So cool. I love it. I'm having a time of my life right now, guys. I don't know if this is boring for you guys, but I'm having a blast. Note-taking software and fact checking on the internet. Oh man, I love it. Fucking I could do this all day. I really could. Maybe I should do that. Maybe we should go be like a fact checking person for a publisher of some kind. Maybe we can go hit up some online magazines or websites or newspapers and apply to be an online fact checker for them. I could get into that. I could work for Snopes. I would love to work for Snopes. Like imagine being able to tell people that, like, yo, I work for Snopes. They're like, you're the Snopes guy? Yeah, I'm the Snopes guy. I'm the guy who finds it out. Man. Could be, oh man. Yeah, and then you could stream your work. Oh my God, you could stream you finding out the info. Oh man, this is it's a calling, guys. It's a calling. It was meant to be. Okay. So now we're on page 2. All right, arguments. We must construct arguments. So here's my argument, and I'm open to any other arguments, either in line with or opposing or into a third avenue of mine. So my argument is that regulation is inherently necessary for the prolonged success of capitalism. That's my argument. My base argument, Casey Rich, hello, welcome in. So that's my base argument. My base argument is that capitalism inherently is a negative feedback loop that is unsustainable in its raw form and requires regulation to balance it. That's my argument. So obviously that's in contrast to another argument, which is that the market should decide, right? You hear that expression a lot, that let the market decide is an often conservative used battle cry when regulations are tried to being imposed. So perfect example was whether or not a company can be forced to sell a product to someone they don't agree with, right? Do I have to make a wedding cake for someone who is gay, or can I deny them service, right? And the argument is let the market decide, right? So if it's so and it's a really stretched argument, and I'm very, as if you can't tell, I'm slightly biased in this. I will not shy away from my biases in this show. You will, if I have a bias, I will outright nail it. I'll nail it to the wall. I'll put it. Ooh. Ooh, content. Content, guys, content. We can literally nail our biases to the wall. Well, not literally nail, but sticky pat them to the wall. So if we got like a nice juicy marker, this is a highlighter. I don't have a juicy marker in my desk. What kind of desk is this? Shit, I'm gonna have to use a purple highlighter. I'm gonna have to find my juicy markers somewhere. I don't know where my juicy marker. Okay. Ugh. All right. Bias number one that I'm nailing to the wall here. Can y'all see that? It's there. It's there. You can't read it, but you can see it. There. Nailing my biases to the wall. I love it. So the idea of like letting the market decide relies on the fact that the general consensus of the public is morally compassed enough to regulate itself, which if that's true, you wouldn't need government in the first place. Hey, what do you know? So yeah, seems bad. Seems bad. But that is the idea, right? So the idea being that if it is truly morally reprehensible for a company to deny business to gay people, then the market will choose not to support that business, and that business will go out of business, and therefore you don't need to regulate it because the system is self-correcting. Which is interesting because that would mean, and again, if this is a bias, let me know, but that would mean that the people that cry foul about cancel culture are against free market. I'm just right? Like that's so, go figure. Believe it or not, cancel culture is free market capitalist. Who knew? Who knew? It's almost like that's how the system's supposed to work. It's amazing, isn't it? Isn't it amazing? Cool. All right. Does anyone in chat have a third thing? I mean, again, there's always the danger of being black and white, being polar, being binary in our argument structures. So we will always allow for gray area, middle ground, third axes of consideration. So if anyone has insight into another argument that can be constructed in capitalism, like just capitalism doesn't work, period, would be an example, or capitalism will always work. Those are two different axes you could draw, and like it doesn't matter what the capitalism is as long as it's capitalism, kind of a thing. Yeah. Again, dramatic pauses for chat. Anything you guys want to add, extrapolate upon? Capitalism only works when a certain percentage agrees to the rules, right? Yes, so if we go back to our definitions, right? The fettering, half of the regulation is regulation through an authoritative body, right? So if capitalism, I'm trying to word this in a way that makes more sense. Capitalism is a format, right? It's an outline, it's an idea that has to be applied to the real world, right? It is not Capitalism is not real. It's not a thing. It's an idea that is applied to reality, right? So, in order to call something a capitalist society, by necessity, the majority of that society would need to adhere to those virtues and processes, right? Also, it is more concretely established by how the economic system you live in is built, right? So our economic system is built with land ownership and private property. Those are inherent constructions, at least in America. Those are inherent constructions in our society. That is how the country is structured. So it's built into the fabric of the society, which is why you have very interesting things happen when, you topple a regime and try to bring in democracy to a previously non-democratic society, because the fabric of their society is not built to reinforce and fortify those values and that way of existing in the world, right? No, we're not. No. Nope. We're not going there. That's the line, Doom. That's the line. That's an entirely different conversation. Another stream. That's an entirely another stream. We're not going there. But the reason why democracy doesn't always take in an otherwise not democratic country is because there is that mental bifurcation. There's a incongruousness in the social workings, because if it's a country that isn't used to having private property, then the majority of the populace isn't really going to latch on to the idea of private property. They're like, oh, cool, so I own my house. How is that any different from before? And they're not going to understand the inherent meaning of that. And then you get oligarchs, right? You get these people who do understand it, and then they take advantage of the people who don't understand it, and they amass a huge amount of wealth during the transition periods of the government stage, and that's a huge problem, right? So it's a good point to bring up about consensus. You can't just throw capitalism into a non-capitalist society. It's not going to take. It's not going to stick. It does have to be woven into the society, but it's kind of a chicken and the egg situation, because you can't call it capitalism if it's not built and functioning as capitalism. But capitalism has its own definition, right? You see what I mean, right? So, like, if the majority of the people weren't following the capitalism rules, I wouldn't call that a capitalism in the first place, right? See what I'm saying? You see what I'm saying? I know I'm talking in circles right now, but that's because the answer is a circle itself, right? So it's kind of by definition, yeah. If most people were not following the rules, then I wouldn't even call it capitalism. Right. So, like in your example, right? If most people were just plundering and arsoning, right? They were stealing resources for themselves and destroying resources of other people. That would be called anarchy, not capitalism. That would be called anarchy. I wouldn't call that capitalism. I would call that anarchy. So, and plus in that system, right? So in that system, trade isn't encouraged nor free, right? It's not a matter of trading. It's just taking and destroying. So technically, that wouldn't even be capitalism by definition, because you don't have free trade in that setting, right? So yeah, good points. These are all good things. We're flushing everything out really nicely. All right, do we have any third arguments here? Any third arguments? Either that capitalism will never work, or capitalism will always work, or capitalism is only a portion of a bigger system that works or doesn't work, right? Anything you want to go here? Always open to third ideas. But as for now, these are our two arguments as they are. I need to see if there's a way to, like, can I rename page? Perfect. Definitions. Yeah. And then rename this one arguments. Arguments. You guys are gonna learn so much about me in this. I feel so self-conscious watching people watching me type. It's a process. Getting things out of the brain of Shen into the real world, in case you haven't noticed, in Record Hunters and Stream, it's a process. It's a process. It's a messy process. Okay. So we'll call this argument 1. And we'll call this argument 2. Man, I mean, people knock Windows for a lot of things, but their software is good. Windows Excel and Windows OneNote. I'm gonna just give a quick shout out right now to Windows. They get a lot of shit, but their programming is on fire. Come on. Minesweeper, Solitaire, the pinball game, OneNote, Excel. Those are it. You can't knock it. You can't knock it. They deserve all the money. Bill Gates deserves all the money. Chief capitalist, Bill Gates. Okay. That being said, there have been plenty of bad Windows software. Yeah. Windows 95, Windows 98, Windows 2000, Windows XP, Windows 7, and Windows 10. Just all now. Windows 6, Windows Vista, Internet Explorer. They can't all be winners. They can't all be winners. All right. So let's go into argument number 1. Regulation inherently necessary for the success of capitalism. Okay, I'm gonna draw out. I wonder if I should do this with visual aid or not. Maybe we could. Argument 1. Great. I'm gonna try to do this with a visual. We're gonna try to make this visual here. Okay. All right. Assume we have 3 businesses, right? Oh, we have shapes. Perfect. Okay. Assume we have 3 businesses. Business 1. Oh geez. What? Why? I don't. There it is. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm still learning the software here, guys. I'm still learning the software. Business 1, business 2, business 3. Right? We have. Perfect. Okay, so here's a very rudimentary argument for basic, like, we're stripping capitalism down to its most basic functions, right? Okay, so they all sell the same product. We'll use widgets. Widgets are always good. They sell widgets. They all sell widgets. Same provider. Same consumer. Same price. Right? It makes sense, right? You got 3 hardware stores all selling widgets. They sell the widgets for $2 each because they buy from the same provider, they sell to the same people, and they've mashed it. Just like with gas prices, right? When you go to a corner off of a highway, a corner intersection off a highway, you've got the 3 gas stations, and they all have their prices the same because they're all competing with each other. So all of their prices are as low as possible while still keeping the business functional, right? Okay. Now, there's a couple things that the companies could do to get an edge, right? So one thing the companies could do to get an edge is try to bargain with the provider, right? So what they could do is they could say, hey, I know we're only buying these, once every week, but what if we signed a contract where we were guaranteed to buy this many from you every week for a year? Or what if we bought a year's supply outright right now and you just ship it to us once a week as we need it, right? So you could bargain with your provider to try to drop the price a little bit in order to get an edge on the competitors. But if the provider is willing to do that with one business, they would be willing, essentially, again, we're keeping this very simple, they would be willing to do it with all businesses. So that's something all the businesses could do to get the price down. So again, going back to the same provider, anything you change there would change on all of them, right? So then you've maximized the efficiency of price on the purchasing end, right? So same consumer. Now, what could you do on the consumer end? With the consumer end, you could provide more service, right? So you could charge more than $2 for the widget because you'll give them free widget polishing every month. They can come in once a month and get their widget polished for free, right? Or you could sell them a guarantee on their widget. Your widget will perform for 3 years, or we'll give you your money back, but you will have to pay an extra 50 cents per widget, right? So there are things you could do on the consumer end to increase your profits, but you can't just charge more, right? So what you could do is, you could sell it for $2.50 each, but if you're not giving more for the consumer, then they're going to go to the other stores, right? Because why would you buy it for $2.50 if you can get the exact same thing for $2? There has to be something different, right? So that's something you could do on the consumer end of things, right? To change that. The other thing you could do is change the costs of your business, right? So if you could find a cheaper way to provide electrical power to your business, you could do that. But again, anything the one business could do, the other businesses could do. Right, exactly, Casey Rich. So you could say we charge 50 cents more per widget, but that's to provide you with cashiers at all times. We have more cashiers than any other store, and you'll never wait more than 3 people to buy your widget, right? So again, yeah, things you can do there. But the other thing you can do is reduce the cost of what it takes to operate your business. So your operational costs, either in heating, cooling, general electrical use, maintenance use, right? So where does this incentivize businesses? Well, if we go back to our definitions, right? If we go back to our definitions, acquisition equals winning. So the more you can get for less is rewarded in capitalism by definition, right? So to me, that sparks immediate problems, right? That immediately sets up a huge negative precedent, right? So when we go back to our options here, when you go to the providers, right, who you're buying from, you could enter those contracts, but then you could go back on those contracts, right? You could say, oh, well, we put in a clause that you didn't read that said at any time we can choose to end this agreement because we're unhappy with the quality of your widgets, even though nothing's changed, right? So even if it's like a a proper agreement, the store could back out of it, right, on some technicality against the provider. And obviously, that's currently protected against with our government because our government enforces contracts, right? If you break a contract, then you have a civil case and you can get taken to court and the resources will be redistributed accordingly, right? So already off of the gate, just the agreement of the market, right? So in purchasing from your provider and you have an agreement, you have your free trade, you still need a regulatory body in place to enforce the trade itself, right? And then the question being, how far does that regulation have to go to ensure fair trade, right? So obviously, if people don't trust in making purchasing agreements, then they're not going to make purchasing agreements. But because capitalism rewards purchasing agreements because you get things for cheaper, you need a system that will protect the people who enter those purchasing agreements, right? And so this is where my argument comes in, is that you have these things that are necessary for the success of capitalism, right? So you could argue that a company that is known to break its agreements with its providers will just be shunned by everyone and then no one will do business with them. But someone will always do business with them, right? A sucker is born every second. The idea being you can't guarantee that everyone will know everything all the time, right? So to me, and again, this is open to debate. So if people have contrast examples or ideas, do feel free to pop them in chat. But to me, it sounds that in the interest of the success of capitalism, you need people to trust in the processes that capitalism rewards. And to do that, you need a government body that can regulate those things and enforce them so that when people are attempted to be taken advantage of, that system will be corrected, right? Going back onto the consumer, right? So with the consumer, and again, this is something that already kind of exists, it's that you can't promise anything, right? So going back to the widget idea, right? You can't say we'll polish your widget free once a month and then just not do it, right? So again, going back to the government regulation, you need at least a system that will enforce that whatever promises are made are kept, right? Correct, Kira. Correct. Exactly. That's exactly the point, right? So you can't, that's exactly the point. You can't assume everyone knows everything all the time. That's a very, in my mind, in my opinion, a very dangerous expectation of the public to be 100% informed 100% of the time. It's not feasible as a metric, at least right now. Even with our instant communication and everything a fingertip touch away, if all we did all day was just spend our time knowing everything all the time, we'd never get anything done, right? Every answer is just 10 more questions in disguise, right? So you have a question, you answer that question, well, now you have 10 more questions. It's never going to be an ending process, right? So again, going back to what companies can do to get those edges, again, whether it's coming from the provider or going to the consumer, it has to be something that is protected to ensure that the people trust in the system. So again, seems inherent on that front. And then that gets into the price. So I guess instead of price, we should say same operation costs is a better way to phrase this, right? So again, people could, instead of having the temperature at 72 degrees, peak at 75 degrees during the summer, right? Or instead of heating up to 68 degrees in the winter, they could heat it just up to 60 degrees in the winter. And that would save you operation costs, but you could also argue that that's going to cost you some customers, right? Some customers would be like, oh, I hate going to that store. It's always too hot, right? So with operation costs, there's things you could do that the market does balance, but there's also things you could do that the market doesn't balance, right? So why would you use a more stable material to build your building when you could use a less stable, more cheap material to build your building, right? So there's certain things that can't be decided by the market. But at the same time, right, if your business repeatedly has parts of the ceiling falling on its customers, right? You can't just say the market's going to decide, right? You can't just say, oh, well, then people will just stop shopping there. It's like, well, yes, but one, if all 3 stores did that, right, they would all save money. If all 3 stores agreed to just make their buildings as shitty as possible, then any store you went to, you would risk the ceiling falling on your head. And then your argument at that point is like, well, that's just the risk you take when you go to a store instead of growing it yourself, right? Like, it's so, in my mind, again, I think it's a stupid argument, right? At which point you have to, again, regulation seems to be inherent. So even just on the basic principles, in my mind, and again, open to argument if anyone in chat disagrees with the assumptions being made, just the basic application of capitalism, in my mind, requires inherent regulation. At the very least, to establish trust in the system, right? The people participating in the system need to know that they can trust in the system, that the system won't be just used to deceive them, right? And I feel like that makes regulation inherent. And even getting down to the point of just public safety, right? So going back to the operation costs, if the building is so poorly made and maintained that it's actually a danger to the people, morally, I feel like that is an issue, right? Especially since in a truly free market capitalism, all companies could just decide to do it that way, right? So that would be my argument just on a basic operational system, right? Any disagreements where we go here? And cockroach questions, exactly, Samath. Exactly, right? If one store had cockroaches and just decided, we'll just leave them, right? And it becomes a public health concern, you could say that the market would just choose not to go to that store. But if all stores agreed just to not handle the cockroach problems to save money, then it's like, oh, well, that's just the price you pay going to a market, right? So, that's initially where I stand, is that even just the application of capitalism does inherently require some regulation of some kind, as that goes to it. So yeah, that's basic argument there. Now we've only addressed a portion of our initial definition, right? So this was acquisition, right? We were just talking about acquisition right now. There's 3 more things here: free trade, private land, and sellable labor, right? So let's go down to the private land thing. So as it's been drawn into the diagram, we've separated business 1, 2, and 3. And that separation visually would represent, obviously, the separation of private land. Private land in this context is it's your sphere of influence, to borrow a phrase. is the area in which you have uh, private authority, right? And for those of you who don't know how the government is structured, this is what you need to keep in mind anytime you make an argument, especially if you're arguing for a federal ruling. Like, a lot of people want federal action on gun control, which to an extent I would agree with. But what you need to keep in mind is the way rules work, at least in America. You have federal laws that apply everywhere. Then you have state laws that apply within those states that go on top of the federal laws. So a perfect example of this right now, federally, marijuana is illegal. But in the state of Colorado, marijuana is not illegal. And the difference being there, federal law states you must report your income from taxes even on illegal substances, which seems like a joke. Like, oh, so, you know, if a heroin dealer isn't paying taxes on their heroin dealings, you could arrest them for that, which one is true, right? That's how they got Al Capone with the tax evasion, right? But also it's for that exact situation. It's for when a state declares something not illegal against the federal ruling of legal. So you have this background layer of federal rules. And then on top of that, you put the state rules, which are usually more specific to the region and that supersede the federal rules. Now, in America, it's a little different than most other parts in the world because it really is state first. Like, that's how the whole Civil War thing starts, with a state seceding from the Union, is because the federal government, in its right, can override state law, right? So the final law is always the federal law, and it's the state that's just on top of the federal law. So the reason that the Civil War essentially happened is because the states refused the authority of the federal law, so the federal law had to, by force, enforce those rules onto the states that weren't in agreement. And that works other ways too. So when they were trying to integrate schools, when they ended segregation, same thing, right? There were states that were resistant to the end of segregation. So the federal system had to enforce its rules onto the state with force, right? So we'll touch that another time. We'll touch that out. We haven't even touched critical race theory. This isn't even critical race theory. This is just basic general knowledge history at the moment. So that's the format. You have the federal law, and then on top of that is the state law. And then on top of that, you have city law, right? So when there are city ordinances, like there's a curfew or businesses have to be closed on Sunday, or you can't sell alcohol at a gas station, right? That's an even smaller subset of rules for an even smaller subset of area on top of the state laws, on top of the federal laws, right? And then the idea of private land is it's just one more layer, right? So you have federal, which is government, you have state, which is government, you have city, which is government, and then you have private. So finally, you have a layer that is not government regulated. So the idea being, with that land, you have a private land, which gives you private rules on top of your city rules, on top of your state rules, on top of your federal rules, right? And I think we run into the same problems again. So the idea being, like, we look at masks. The reason why legally a business can demand that people wear masks to shop at their store is because that is the private property rules on top of the city rules, on top of the state rules, on top of the federal rules. And so the city would have to override that private property rule. Like in Florida, I believe, we should probably start doing some fact checking. This is some good fact checking opportunity here, right? So Florida anti-mask legislation, right? And if it's not Florida, it's Texas, right? Let's see. Great. So here's a perfect idea, right? And I think this probably goes to state federal. We're trying to see state private. Florida politics. What the hell is this website? I'm just trying to find a good based story to start digging into here. And if anyone has specific examples, do let me know so we can expedite the searching process. All right. At the very least, what we have right now, these are county levels. So there's no state mandate, but the county is electing to put a mandate on top of the state's lack of a mandate, right? And what we were looking at before is the federal versus state things, right? So the idea being, if the federal government tries to say all states must do this, the state can try to fight that, right? Oh, the actual executive order. Let's look at it. Wait, what? Hold on. Sorry, I know this is not about mask mandates, but schools, including those that did not require students to be masked, did not drive community transmission of COVID-19. How is that even close to being true? Face my bullets, welcome in. Hold on. What? What? What kind of madness is that? You guys see this, right? Right here? This one right here? Schools, including those that did not require students to be masked, did not drive community transmission of COVID-19. What? That is a big assumption to make. That is a big assumption to make. Forcing children to wear masks could inhibit breathing, lead to the collection of dangerous impurities, and adversely affect communications in the classroom. Sorry, I know that's not what this is about. But this is, oh my goodness. A governor wrote this, guys. This is what a governor wrote. This is an official governor of a state's executive order. There's no statistically significant evidence to suggest that counties with mask requirements have fared any better than those without. Yeah, maybe because people travel from county to county. And I'm sure there was a difference, but oh my God, I gotta go away. I can't look at it anymore. I can't read it anymore. All right. But that's the idea, right? So those are the layers, and the battles go back and forth, right? So the state could try to say that the private can't mandate masks, and the private can say that the state can't tell the private that it can or cannot require masks. And then you go to the federal level to get a ruling that gets enforced all the way down, right? So each layer can make its independent conclusion and ruling, but the enforcement of the law is kind of it's a right by might situation, essentially. Yeah. So a state could impose a tax on the business that makes those decisions, and the federal could have a tax break for them, right? And you could have these conflicting incentives and disincentives to try to influence each layer along the way, right? So the idea of that private land, I know this is where we were going from in the beginning, right? Let's go back to our argument here. But the idea of the private land is it gives you a non-government layer to that process, right? And the question being, even though it's necessary to capitalism, is it necessary for function, right? So if we go back to our example with where they can make costs. So each store, because it's on private property, is allowed to have its private set of rules, which would allow them to cater to different demographics and cater to those demographics better and worse. I think Chick-fil-A is a perfect example of that, right? So Chick-fil-A has these rules that, some people really agree with and some people really don't agree with. And the market kind of decides in that situation, right? The problem, again, going to the point where if a private enterprise starts infringing the state or federal rights of individuals, right? So if we go back to segregation, you could have a private school that is trying to say we don't accept non-white students, but the federal government can say you cannot deny education based on race. That is a federal violation of what it means to be an American. And then the federal law enforces that rule onto the private company, right? So again, I think we get into a little bit of that necessity of regulation, right? So in order to establish faith in the system, the people that are participating need to know their rights won't be violated by a company just because they're on private property. Again, it seems inherent a level of regulation is required to maintain that, right? And they're losing, face my bullets, and they're losing. That's the best part. And they're losing. Because they don't have any factual, logical argument to establish in court. But yeah, so I think that's point 2, where we have established acquisition inherent in having regulation, and private land inherent in having regulation, right? Any discrepancies, arguments, counterpoints that people would like to get into based on our assumptions so far? Dramatic pause. Seems good. All right. We will move on. So free trade. Now we have free trade. It's all good, Casey Rich. Yep, we'll be putting these on YouTube. Sounds good. All right, so free trade. Ugh, all right, this is where we might have to look a lot up, because I'll admit, legally, I don't have the most Legally, I don't have the most flushed out knowledge on this topic. Okay, so when we talk about free trade, what initially comes to mind for me is like insider trading, right? So the issues we get into now is the existence of the stock market, in my opinion. I think that's where free trade really comes in the most. I don't think there's much argument in the basic ability for people to trade, other than just enforcing the agreements, which we already touched on, right? So the buyer can choose to buy from and not buy from whoever they want. The seller can choose to sell to and sell to and not sell to anyone they want, right? So the basic ability to trade, I don't think anyone's really arguing as far as just enforcing those freedoms. But I think what it comes down to more is in the stock market, when you're buying and selling stocks and making these trades on larger scales in faster time, that's a bit harder to materialize, right? When you go to buy a chicken from the store, you physically can have the chicken and the store can physically have your money, or even digitally have your money. But it's all done in this like hostage negotiation setup. Like they've got their product in their store and they'll let you like inspect the product, but then you can't take the product out of the store until you give them their money, and you have your money and they have to get it from you, like, right? You know what I mean? Like there's a thing there with stuff. It's a thing with stuff. You can physically stop someone from leaving the store with your chicken if they didn't give you the money for the chicken, right? So that's that one aspect. But when you get into like stock market, it's a lot more, it's all about capital in the cerebral, right? It's about representations of resources more so than actual resources. So when you have free market, it has a volatility to it that is subject to sorry, hold on a sec. I want to duplicate. There we go. Blah. Okay, anyway. You have these representations of resources that are subject to public opinion, essentially, right? So if everyone just agrees that something's worth more all of a sudden, it's worth more all of a sudden, right? You do see this materially, kind of like in the Black Friday and Christmassy kind of situation, where even Thanksgiving, really. So like you could buy a turkey sometime early October for a cheaper price, and then trying to buy a turkey at Thanksgiving is a much higher price, and then trying to buy a turkey after Thanksgiving is a much cheaper price, right? So you do see these like micro fluctuations in value based on public opinion. But again, it's still physically tangible, right? It's because there's a physical number of turkeys in the store. So there is a set supply and the demand is higher, so the price goes up. And then after Thanksgiving, if they have leftover turkeys, demand is down to zero, but they still have some supply, so now the price drops, right? But with something like a stock market, it really is just subject to public opinion. When you had the Reddit boys that took on the hedge fund and just like completely tanked their investment because they bought it or they had scheduled to buy it cheap, So they were invested in tanking the price of the stock, right, in order to get a bunch of money. The GameStop thing, right? And so if you increase the price before that scheduled purchase, then suddenly they have to pay a lot more money than they were expecting to. And in that free market sense, it really becomes a question of like, what can you do and what can't you do, right? So if the idea is there's no regulation, then there would be no accountability or transparency, right? So you would never have to say when you are going to sell something or when you're not going to sell something. And if you know something about the company other people know, that's just your advantage, right? And I think it's pretty obvious to see how that could get out of hand really fast, because that would mean anyone who is in control of a company would be able to buy and sell based on what they know about the company and just game the system the entire time, even against their own company's interest based for personal profit, right? So they could know that they're going to just tank their store and dissolve it into nothing in a year, and they'll sell everything before they do anything and then do it. So they make a whole bunch of money and everyone else hurts, right? So in the interest of making that system transparent in order to establish fairness, there's an inherent regulation where you have to make your your purchases public. And there are conflicts of interest. There are lines you can't cross as an investor and as a business operator. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in place already to kind of regulate that stuff. And I think it's pretty easy to see why. We can go more specifically into this if people want to clarify some of my muddiness, because admittedly, again, this is not something I'm fully educated on. But that is kind of the idea when it comes to free trade and regulation, is that with free trade, there's no accountability and there's no transparency, at which point, with something like the stock market, that becomes a huge problem and, again, necessitates some level of regulation. Scarborough, with crypto, crypto technically is regulated, right? So, and this is hard for a lot of people to understand, but if we go into, let me see, is it, let's see. Yeah, it's technically regulated through blockchain, right? So let's go to blockchain real quick. Right, so the way it's regulated is kind of by consensus, by the people who participate in things. So there are a lot of cryptocurrencies out there, and there are cryptocurrencies that people don't like, that, you know, disappear and fall off. And then there are cryptocurrencies that people do like and continue to take off. So Bitcoin being a perfect example here. I wonder if this is going to show. Yeah, okay. So here's kind of how it is technically regulated, right? So what is on the right-hand side here is buying and selling in the future. So you can look at past trades and you can look at future trades. So if someone makes a huge purchase because they know that the price is going to skyrocket in a month, you'll be able to see that, right? And so it is technically still regulated within the consensus, right? So you're letting the free market decide, but the free market is deciding what set of rules they like and don't like, right? So there are there are cryptocurrencies that have no regulations whatsoever, but obviously people were doing, insider trading type stuff with that, which meant the entire thing was unusable as a currency, and it fell apart and they aren't around anymore, right? But something like Bitcoin is technically regulated by having all the information being transparent, right? So it's still regulated. And yes, it's using market forces to regulate itself. But the reason market forces are able to regulate it is because of the regulation inherent in Bitcoin, where it shows you who's buying and who's selling in the past and in the future. And that helps ensure the quality and reliability of the currency. And that gets more people trusting in the system. And that's what we were talking about before, right? The regulations being there to instill trust into the people participating so that they continue to participate in it. And again, that is technically a regulation. It's not much of a regulation, and that's kind of the brilliance of it, is all you need to really regulate it is just nothing's hidden. Put all the information out there, and voila. And as Faced by Bullets said, even if the cryptocurrency itself isn't regulated, the moment you try to transfer it to US dollar, it is, right? If you ever had to pay a transaction fee, a exchange fee, an investment fee, all of those things, that's technically regulation, right? That's saying you can do whatever you want with this non-American money, but the moment you make it American money, we're going to retroactively apply all the rules to it. So there is regulation in both directions. So I think it's a good point to make. But that is, and if anything, that's more in defense of my argument, right, Scorba? Because the cryptocurrencies that have no regulation fall apart and aren't around anymore. And the cryptocurrencies that do have decent regulations to establish confidence in the people participating are the ones that succeed the most, right? So I think that still falls under the argument. Okay. Well, Scorba, if you want to extrapolate on that, please do so. That's kind of what today's all about. The argument at hand, just to review, the argument at hand is that regulation is inherently necessary for the prolonged success of capitalism, right? So if you're more in camp 2 when it comes to cryptocurrency, it would be really interesting to see the argument structured around that. And if you have a lengthy contribution to make, you can always drop it in Discord. Oh, we'll plop that in here just because we can. Okay, no, that's good. That's good, Scorba. I appreciate your honesty. I would like to entertain that idea more. So if we can structure something around that later on in the stream today, we can do that. But I guess we'll move on for now. But I would argue that there has to be some enforceable system to instill confidence for the consumers, the participants, in order for it to succeed. But again, we'll save that nitty-gritty for perhaps a later time. All right, so now we go back to our original definitions. We've done acquisition, private land, free trade, and now sellable labor. Ooh, hot button issue for me. Are we gonna put another bias on the wall here? We're gonna have to put another bias on the wall. Hold on. Another bias on the wall. We're gonna call this one the American extortion of retail and service labor. Posting it. Nailing it to the wall. Boom. Nailing the biases to the wall. Okay. So again, a little bit of how to button chivalry, so I have a lot to say on this. If we go back to our three shops, right? So we're talking about provider, consumer, operation costs. Operation costs also includes labor. So in this example we established, right? One company could decide to pay its employees less. Yeah, we could definitely do an episode on crypto, Scorba. I participated in the BitClout for a while, so I do have experience in that. It'd be interesting to talk about that at some point. So in this example, right, so if one company decides to pay its workers less, you could argue on the free market side that those employees would all quit, and then that company would have no workers, and then the business would fall apart, right? The issue being people always need to work. So that argument only works in a system where there are more jobs than people. And in that definition, in a system where there are always more jobs than people, then businesses are always failing. Which is why in my argument would be that that's unsustainable, right? It is literally unsustainable to always have more jobs than people, because then something is always failing, right? So to me, I think that's an invalid argument to say that the market would decide against a company that decides to pay its workers less, because that only works if there are more jobs than people, and you cannot sustain a situation where there are always more jobs than people, because that requires there always to be something failing. There's always going to be shifts between more people than jobs, more jobs than people. That's always going to go back and forth. That's just a cyclical relationship. It's like a predator-prey relation, right? So in my mind, there's an inherent regulation required to ensure that workers are not being extorted. Even the most basic arguments is the non-indentured servitude laws, right? So right after slavery, the initial solution was, okay, we'll just pay them, but not enough to actually do anything, right? So the idea being is, okay, we'll pay you $5 an hour for your work, but we're going to cost you, we're going to charge you $100 a day for housing, and $20 a day for food, and $5 a day for water, right? And they're not making $125 a day, so they just constantly go into debt, and then they can't leave, which is slavery, right? But the problem is that those indentured servitude laws are all self-contained. So that is under the assumption that the business that is housing you is also the business that is employing you. And the problem being, you can build a more complex system that still has indentured servitude, but with that legal loophole. So the legal loophole being like, oh, well, we don't own their houses, but the housing is still at a cost, right? And so you could still have an indentured servitude situation if there's just an unspoken agreement, or even just the happenstance of the cost of living versus the cost of wages, right? And so again, going back to the basic inherent functionality of capitalism, it would seem that you would need regulation inherently to ensure the success of capitalism, which is why something like the federal minimum wage was established. And again, that goes back to those layers of government, right? So a state could have a higher minimum wage than what the federal law requires, and a store can have a higher minimum wage than what the state requires, right? So those are all different layers to that solution. And that's something that very hot button right now for sure with the $15 minimum wage. And I don't even think $15 minimum wage is going to solve anything. I really think it's anyone earning less than $50,000 a year needs to have their wages, doubled, right? Like, right? Like it needs to be like a proportional thing. So like if you make less than $50,000 a year, your wages need to be doubled. And if you make like $50,000 to $75,000 a year, you get 50%. And if you make 75 to 100, you get 25%, right? Like there needs to be like a gradient bump from bottom to top to really shift everything up a little bit. So that's something that I feel is actually a failing right now. And I would argue that failing is due to a lack of regulation, right? Because you had the huge exodus with everything that went on during the pandemic and still going on with the pandemic. People not wanting to put up with the additional stresses and requirements of the retail environment without additional pay, without compensation. And it all just kind of bellies up, right? So, again, I think that's more, again, to the argument of inherent regulation in capitalism, right? Any nays to that effect? Okay, so at this point, we've gone through the definitions, we've gone through the argument. So here, I guess, is really the real question that boils down, at least in American culture, which is really not so much whether or not capitalism needs to be regulated. I don't think anyone would outright argue against regulation, period. But where the lines need to be drawn for that regulation. Civil rights is always kind of the go-to as to ensuring equality across the board. So I think a good basis is on what people can help and what people can't help, right? So if there are things people can change, and might even argue a bit further, things people can change instantaneously versus what people cannot change instantaneously. I think is a good basis for where that line is drawn, right? So technically, a religion can be changed instantaneously, right? I would argue that any religious discrimination, as it were, would be allowed under at least American law with capitalism, because that's a subjective thing, right? So if a store required you to be of a religion to participate, that would be within their legal right. It's a little messy to say that a store could deny a specific religion. But at least the way I see it, it would be within their legal right. And I would hope that the market would be able to balance that out. This is not to support violations beyond that, right? So this is strictly denying service or denying a free market exchange. I don't think it can go any further than that, right? So the moment there is harassment, the moment there is endangerment, the moment there is social discrimination on a level beyond that. So trying to figure out an easy example to get into on that. Okay, perfect example. So let's say this is not something I would support, just something to argue legally, right? Let's say a business was denying service to Muslims. I would argue that business has its right to do so, but if the community as a whole is oppressing the Muslims in its community, that would be crossing the line, right? So if all the shops and all the stores within the community denied access to Muslims, then that would be something to look at beyond that scope, because that's, in my mind, that goes beyond the private business level. That's a city level or even state level offense, right? Now you're getting into the point of active discrimination, where it is not just a store enforcing a rule, it is a community actively oppressing an otherwise free to express minority, right? So I know it's weird to argue it that way, but I feel like there are those lines to draw. So I would say, for me at least, and if you guys have different lines, I would definitely welcome those in the chat. But for me, anything that can be changed instantly, anything that's not inherent, I think should be allowed to be at the discretion of the business. But that's not to say that there can't be like a class action lawsuit against a community or a large group of businesses that are all doing the same thing, right? What are people's thoughts on the matter? Where do we get into that? I'm trying to get a direction to go with this as far as where lines would be and not be for regulation. Yeah, it's kind of where I was going with that, is that, and it's more so defining the rights of the community, right? So yeah, so in my mind, I think it's of the thing of things that can be changed and not changed, right? So obviously something like your race or your biological sex, those are things you can't change, right? So to discriminate on those levels, I think, is unacceptable and not allowable, both morally and even just functionally as a free society. Um, I don't think those should be on the table at all. Things that cannot be changed. You know, anyone who is under 6 feet can't go to you can't do that, right? Whereas, you know, no shirt, no shoes, no service, right? You can put on a shirt, you can put on shoes. That's something that can be changed instantaneously, right? So, interested to see what other people have to say on drawing the line there. Fair enough. Where would people? What are some categories people would put on either side of the line? Kind of brought up religion. I would be interested to see if anyone thinks religion is something that can't be. See, that's why I picked religion. I think that's a bit more ambiguous. Yeah, so it's a weird. I'll admit it's a weird stance to take, but in my mind, religion really is something that can be changed instantaneously. Obviously, when you're in a religion, it's something you believe in and that your world is built around. So to the individual, it's not something that can be changed instantaneously, right? But it is still a choice, right? And in my mind, you could technically put that on hold for the transaction, for the establishment of a business, right? So, it is conflicting, right? So a business could say you can't wear this particular religious attire in our store, which is a horrible thing to do, and I would hope the free market would balance that out. But I feel like that could still be within the rights of the business, right? Because then I feel like in that situation, the free market could balance it out. But again, that's to make sure that that's only on one instance level. If there's a pattern of that discrimination beyond a single store, that is a problem, right? No, exactly. No Argyle socks allowed. Exactly. I think a company would be within their rights to do that. Well, that's why we're talking about it, Scorba. That's the whole point of the show. We're getting into it. We're going for it. We're pushing in hard. I also realized I'm like kind of too far to the side here. Right? And this goes more to my personal biases, but in my mind, honestly, any religion that tells you what you can and can't do in the physical world, like any physical rules, like you cannot eat this or you must wear this, in my opinion, that's a bullshit religion. Honestly, I'm sorry to say it, but in my mind, that's a bullshit religion. If you're going to hell because you used polyester instead of wool, like what kind of omnipotent being are you worshiping that is that petty? Right? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. I'm sorry. It doesn't. So if you're going to choose to participate in those kinds of restrictions in your faith, I think you should understand you're going to be met resistant. And it's not to single out any one religion, any religion that does that. I would argue against that. Even like, churches that don't allow people to go into the services because they're too shabby. Like if it's a homeless person and they smell bad and they've got ratty clothes and they don't let them into the service. Like, again, that's bullshit, right? It doesn't matter what religion it is. I would say any religion that does that is kind of bullshit on a personal level. On a more free society, open level, like on a single instance company level, I don't think that is something the government should step in on. But the moment it is more than just a company, a store, that's where I feel like it goes against civil rights, right? So the moment there's a pattern of oppression against a particular religion, that's when there's a problem, right? And that's when the federal government can definitely step in and say, you got to cut that shit out, right? So that's where I am, kind of. And Doom, since you're going into like more of the employment side of things, that's another gray area too, right? So there are companies that require you to have a certain attire for whatever reason. It could be for health reasons. Oh, we got Doom. We got our first one, ladies and gentlemen. We got him. We got him. Let me look that up real quick. Thankfully, I can recover the deleted message. Actually, can I do it here too? Hey, look at that. Magic. Let's see. Very hard to strong your beliefs. Other strong held identities in terms of calling bullshit. Percent. Strong hold the requires the. Right, so, and that's, again, this is kind of where I get into these arguments, Doom. So, like, there are certain stores that will have certain attire requirements based on right, exactly. So that's a good case. So being allowed to wear a head covering or not in a company that requires you not to, right? I think it also comes into the necessity of the function of the business, right? So if the reason you have a attire requirement as a business is strictly aesthetic, then that would be optional, in my opinion. I don't think you should be able to enforce an aesthetic choice, right? But like, for instance, let's say you're part of a religion that doesn't let you cover your facial hair, right? It's a religion that says the beard is God's bestowment on men to distinguish them from women, and to cover that is to pretend to be a woman, and therefore you are forbidden to ever cover your facial hair. And you wanted to work in a restaurant where you're required to put a hairnet on your beard so that your hair is not going into the food, right? In that instance, I feel like the company's ruling supersedes that religious expression, right? So I think at that point, it really comes down to whether or not those decisions are essential to the function of the business or not, right? Aesthetic versus necessity, right? Right? So, like, let's say I'm part of a religion that requires me to cut the head off of a rat a live rat once an hour to give patronage to my god, right? So I have to have live rats with me at all times, and I have to cut the head off of a live one every hour. That's my religion, right? Most stores wouldn't allow me to do that, right? Even if it's my religion and I fully believe in it and I'm committed to it, most stores wouldn't let me do that, right? Because the dangers of both live rats and rat blood in the public are of a danger to the public, right? And that's kind of where I'm drawing that line, is whether or not the requirements for the business are aesthetic or essential to the function of the business, right? Right? Full beards and firefighters. Well, so it's weird with firefighters, right? Because a lot of it's really weird, and we'll probably fact check this here. We're gonna fact check this. What are they really called? Like hook and ladder companies? Like, to my understanding, most of them are not public, right? They're private volunteer companies, right? They're not actually a government body. They're actually a private company, right? Like fire departments, they're usually not federal governments like the police, right? Sure, there we go. So there are government-owned and operated fire stations. Okay, but how many of them are, right? There we go. USFA. Now we're getting into this. Now we're getting into FEMA. So there are registered fire departments. But I guess the question is, are they actually... So these are registered. How many are actually public? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. 51,000 in the country. Okay. Okay, so only 4% are state and federal, right? Only 4% are state and federal. The rest, 96% of the fire departments are actually like public, or at least volunteer, right? So either organized by the city or even a private company, right? So again, if a private firehouse company wanted to say you can't have a beard because it's a fire hazard, in my opinion, I think that's a fair thing for the company to enforce. I don't think that's a regulation that the state or federal government could overturn, right? But then once you go into a state or federal company, right? Now if it's a state or federal firehouse, because of the freedom of religion, if it is part of the person's religion not to shave their facial hair, then the federal or state cannot require that person to compromise their faith for the sake of the job. They should still be granted access to the job and allowed to have the religious exception, right? That would be the difference between the state, federal versus private, right? That would be my argument. I'm not saying that is the case. I would say that would be my argument. Right. Right, and I don't think your beard catching on fire would put others in danger. It just puts you in danger, right? I mean, I'm sure there's some court case where they've argued it puts others in danger, but as far as I would argue it, I would say it can't be argued, right? Wait to see if there's any more counterpoints to the argument at hand. Right, and so Score, that's kind of what I'm getting into, right? Is that, to me, I think it comes down to what is aesthetic versus what is necessary, right? So if there's an actual necessity for a requirement of a business in order for the function of that business, then that's where you have to say the business has that right. Versus aesthetic. So something like, you know, Abercrombie and Fitch, there's no real necessity as to whether or not the head should be covered, because they're not selling hair products, right? They're not selling things that you put in your hair. They're selling clothes. So they being able to like the presence of a headdress is not necessity for selling clothes, right? Whereas, like, if you were being if you were selling hair product and the business required you to give live demonstrations of using the product, then you would need to show your hair in public and use the product in your hair in public, right? So if that was their requirement, in that opinion, I feel like that's and to me, it makes sense along those lines, because if the job is promoting something that your religion disagrees with, why are you going for that job anyway? And I know there's the argument that you need to work somewhere, so you should be able to work anywhere. And that goes into the other argument where once it's a pattern of discrimination, that's when it's a problem, right? So if it's, again, this is what I'm talking about, isolating whether it is a single instance of a company versus a social pattern of oppression, right? And I think it's important to draw those distinctions. Like, let's say it's a strip club, right? Let's say you want to work for a strip club, but you refuse to remove your shirt. You can do just underwear, but you can't remove your shirt for religious reasons. Well, then why are you trying to work in a strip club, right? Like, clearly that's not the job for you, and the company, by necessity, needs to require that of you. Therefore, you can't work there, right? So that's the thing, is the difference between necessity and aesthetic. You know, if you're working in most retail situations, it's not going to matter whether or not your head's covered. It's not going to matter what kind of clothes you're wearing, right? You don't need to be wearing a red shirt to sell bananas at Target, right? It's great that that is their uniform so that it's easier to find the employees, but that does not trump the individual rights, and therefore regulation required. You can't enforce that rule, right? Whereas, you know, going back to the beard example, if you're in a restaurant and you need to wear a hairnet on your beard to keep your beard hair from falling into the food, then your religious exemption would not apply there, because that's not a aesthetic, that's a necessity, right? So that's kind of where I draw the line. What can and cannot be changed instantaneously, and what is aesthetic versus what is mandatory for the function of the business. I think those are the two variables to pit against each other. Oh yeah, they do. Yeah, I see them all the time. And most of them don't fit very well. Most of them don't fit well at all. They're always awkward. I'm waiting for the day that there's actually like good beard hairnets. They're always trying to see the most. Yeah, usually they're like this. This is what they usually look like, and they do a terrible job. They do an absolutely terrible job of what they're supposed to do. But there are beard nets for hair, or hair nets for beard, I should say. That's a good one. I like this one. This is a good one. Everything but the eyes. Oh, but the eyebrows. But the eyebrow hair. Guys, the eyebrow hair. You gotta cover it. You gotta cover it. This is great. I love it. Keep all hair contained. I would wear a mask instead of a beard net. Honestly. Like this to me, these are terrible. These don't do a good job in my opinion. Also, I'm pretty sure his front hair is longer than his beard hair. He should probably also have a hairnet, right? But I would probably just wear a mask instead of wearing whatever the fuck that is. I don't know what that is even supposed to be. What is that even supposed to do? That does not look like it does the job in my mind. But yeah, they make them. They're just not very good most of the time. That's another thing too. Like, I'll see even in professional kitchens, they'll not have their hair pulled back. Like, there was a clip floating around. It was like Gordon Ramsay's first television appearance, and he was like an apprentice to the actual chef of the show. So he was just like doing the sous chef stuff, and his boss had hair like as long as mine, just all over the place, wasn't tied up, didn't have a hat, didn't have anything. And I was like, oh my god, he prepares food like that? Like, just at least have it tied or like, good. No thank you. No thank you. But yeah, they make them. Cool. Any other thoughts on this whole thing? I mean, we're not looking to have the finite end-all be-all conclusions here. We're just discussing the way things is and what we think are good and bad things. that's kind of where I stand on it. Gender expression. Great. Doom. I would say that's not something that can be changed instantaneously. You know, what gender you are, what your sexual orientation is, that's not something you can change. That's just something you are. Right? You can, I think it's no different than biological sex, right? Those are things that cannot be changed. At least not instantaneously. So I don't think you can make any rulings on that at a private level. That is not something you can restrict. That is not a choice in my mind. It is. I don't think it's a choice as nearly as much as religion is, right? Any other points to draft out? Yeah, that's where I fall, Kira. Perfect example, right? Let's put it this way, okay? Most people have the religion of their parents, right? Which is an argument towards environment, nurture versus nature. Whereas most gay people, just to keep it real simple, like let's go sexual orientation, let alone non-binary, do not have parents with the same affiliation, right? So something that naturally goes against parental influence has to be stronger of an identity than a religion, right? It's not a coincidence that most Christians have Christian parents. It is a coincidence that most gay people do not have gay parents, because it has nothing to do with it. The parent has no effect on that, right? So I think that's at least in my mind, that's pretty cut and dry. That might be a good topic for another week. We could get into that on another week. I know a couple streamers that might be willing to participate in that conversation. I'm sure they'd have a lot to say on the topic. And again, if you have any streamers that you know of that are passionate about a topic that you think would be good for this show, feel free to drop that in the Discord, and we could reach out to them and see if that's something they'd be willing to do, or have them reach out to me. That would be much better. I'm doing my best not to approach people because I don't want to put people into a potentially volatile situation. But if they are willing to do so on their own volition, I definitely welcome them to do so. And I think it's been a successful first episode. I look forward to the feedback from everyone. Hope you all enjoyed this dive into a pretty agreeable topic. I don't think we got into anything too controversial, but you don't want to go right into the middle of the fire. You kind of want to test the waters first before you dive all the way in. So I think this was a good introductory little feel around of what we could kind of do with this thing. Hope you all enjoyed it. Hope you had fun. And again, if you have any ideas for either topics or people, do let me know in Discord. And that will conclude it for this week. So thank you all. Capitalism. Regulation to some extent required. I think we can all agree. But where? Food for thought. We'll see you next week.